How many of you were here last night for our economic debate? Look at that. That's what I wanted to see. Well, if you haven't noticed, it's already on YouTube, and it's being spread like wildfire. Because it was one hell of a debate. And one of the men at that debate is right here. How many of you here have seen a film called The Money Masters? That was one of the first films to wake me up to that.
Testing 1, 2.
Things in the world weren't what I thought. So, you ready?
Yep.
So, it is my great pleasure to introduce the one and only Bill Still.
1, 2, testing 1, 2, testing 1, 2. Don't need the feedback. You guys are in for a bad surprise. Because I'm talking from here. Okay, I'm deeply honored to be here today. To have been invited to Long Island. You'll forgive me for reading a speech, but I don't know why God put me in this position, but I'm a pathetic speaker. Last night, for those that were here, I lost my place twice. And so I've just got to read a speech. I mean, that's the way I am. I'm sorry. No one is less qualified to be doing this job than me, but there seems to be nobody else to do it. So, in fact, this might well be the last conference I do. I'm serious. So anyway, I'd like to thank Gigi for putting this together. She's put a lot of her own money into this, and she's not going to get it back. And that's so typical of conferences these days. There's just no money in it, and there's certainly no money in what I do, monetary reform. So, and all the volunteers, I mean, you see half a dozen of them, or a dozen of them standing around here, just huge amounts of work go into something like this. And plus, thank you all for coming out today. That's, without you, none of this happens. And we're just confined to YouTube. So, okay, we're at a very interesting and confusing point in world financial history right now. Central banks have been strongly encouraged by the BIS. This is a picture of the BIS in Basel, Switzerland that I took about a year and a half ago. It's the central bank of central banks. This just came out on June 23rd in a speech by BIS General Manager Jamie Karuna at the bank's annual meeting in Basel. Easy financial conditions can only do so much. More stimulus cannot revive productivity growth. Adding more debt will not strengthen the financial sector, nor will it reallocate resources needed to return economies to real growth. So what in the heck does that mean? Why this dire warning, primarily to the world's largest economy, the U.S.? Because we're living in a shadow world of economic fiction where numbers are made up to keep politicians in power, and most importantly, to keep the debt money system in power. The advanced economies of the world, the red line on the chart, are now running sovereign debt to GDP ratios, and sovereign debt means national debt, to GDP ratios approaching 120%, and it's growing at about an astonishing 5% per year. Certainly this is wildly unsustainable in itself. In fact, anything over 80% is categorized by the IMF as a drag on economies. Over 90% is considered by the IMF as unsustainable, and yet the major economies are now running on average 120% per year. So what's going to happen? No one can know specifically, but unprecedented money growth is adding to the unsustainability of this problem. So here's the resulting U.S. gross domestic product growth rate. So it looks pretty good, all those nice little blue things above the line. The GDP growth numbers are annualized numbers. So really, with this last one, the one on the far right, where it says 4.1%, I don't know if you can see it or not. That's for the third quarter of last year.
Your projector is slightly in front of, you're kind of leaning in front of it.
Okay, thanks for saying that. In any case, the 4.1%, you divide it by 4 to get the actual quarterly number. It's an annualized rate, so it's 4.1% per year. The problem with these numbers is, guess what? Quantitative easing injections are now counted as positive economic activity. That is, they are counted as part of the GDP. Another thing to consider is that the U.S. population is growing at 3% per year. Therefore, in order to stay even, our domestic economy has to grow at 3% per year, just to stay even. That's the red line. However, we have only hit that number in 6 quarters since the crash in 07-08, and all 6 times it was as a result of quantitative easing. So out of 20 quarters, we've hit our target growth rate exactly 6 times, and that's with QE thrown in there. So how big is the effect of QE? Well, let's take a look at this last number, the 4.1% number. The gross domestic product of the U.S. is about $16 trillion. QE throughout 2013 was $85 billion a month, or about $1 trillion a year. That's exactly 6.25% of GDP. Now let's go back to our GDP graph. So what does our economy look like if 6.25% is subtracted from all these numbers? The red line, the 3% line, needed to stay even with population growth, moves up there. The green line, which represents the new 0% line, moves here. So that means that the U.S. has been in recession since QE started, which was right here, the 4th quarter of 2008. So what's the definition of recession? 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. Economic depression is defined as either 8 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth or 1 quarter of a 10% loss in GDP. So either way you want to look at it, if you subtract out QE injections, the U.S. has been in recession for over 5 years now, and a depression for over 3 years. So that's why the BIS is telling nations to stop it. It's not working. It's a giant fake economy that is doomed to failure, global failure. This is a fake economy. Injecting more and more debt money to paper over the problems is just adding to what? The U.S. national debt. This is the debt from 1900 to 2020. We're about here where the blue line is right now. Worst of all, these artificial debt money injections are nothing but economic heroin. Heroin that is killing the real economy. If it was taken away, our economy would fall to levels we haven't seen in 50 years. Okay, so that's the bad news. Now let's start building towards a solution. I'm going to give you a little different look at the sustainability of economic systems. I call it macroeconomics. We're going to look at 4 basic things that you may not have considered in the past, but even when taken individually, are very powerful. Number 1, humankind's 2,500-year march towards freedom. What started it, what tends to work, and why. Number 2, the negative effects of over-consolidation of power on national, economic, and political structures. Number 3, a national debt. Is it effective? Is it necessary? And finally, number 4, the money creation power of a sovereign and why it is important. What is the most important political development of the last 2,500 years of human history? It is certainly the development of self-governance, governance of the people, by the people, and for the people. Governance in the public interest, instead of governance in the interest of a single person, family, or relatively small privileged group. In other words, we're going to be able to hear this? Let's see. Okay, you get the idea. We're gonna pass that one too. Now here you see a Saturday night in a Tehran apartment block with youthful residents calling out for freedom back and forth between the buildings. And once again, this might not be worthwhile. Let's see. Oh, forget it. Suffice it to say, The kids in Tehran, I think 2/3 of Iranians are under 25 years old. They all want to be just like us. They're part of the internet generation. They don't like the theocracy. They don't like the mullahs. They want to be like us. So that's why you see this tendency, the shift towards liberalization right now. Whether it's fake liberalization with the new President Rouhani or not, we don't know yet. But I know one thing for sure. The vast and growing internet generation in Iran is going to wipe them out at some point. And so if they don't liberalize, they're going to go down hard. Okay, this is Rouhani. He was elected by an overwhelming margin. We don't yet know if he's a fake or the real deal, but the Iranian people have spoken decisively for freedom. They should be encouraged by the West. They hate the theocracy. They revolted against it only 18 months ago in the streets, and their students spilled their blood trying to tell the world what they wanted. We didn't help them. So what is this freedom that people are willing to die for to achieve? It's characterized by effective self-governance. Government should be the servant of the people, not the dictator manipulating the public. The people should not fear their government. Instead, they should believe that they can have some influence over the decision-making process. Another of the many attributes of freedom is the rule of law. Government cannot be respected by the citizens unless they perceive the rule of law as something that protects them rather than suppresses them, as something that provides fair and equal justice for every citizen. And remember, it's either the rule of law or the law of the jungle. And no one in this room would voluntarily vote for their families to return to the law of the jungle. By the way, I was shocked last night at the dinner when I debated our friend the anarchist Goldbug. I added this quote last night just for him from none other than J.P. Morgan. As a man of sense, I am a Goldbug and support a Goldbug government and a Goldbug society. As a man of the world, I like confusion, anarchy, and war. This is not a fake quote. This is from a letter J.P. Morgan wrote to his brother. It's a real quote. The third attribute of sustainable self-governance is buy-in, sometimes called the social contract. Buy-in is absolutely critical to the political and economic sustainability of a nation. So, for a government to be sustainable, it must operate fairly or the public will slowly turn against it. Without buy-in, government becomes overwhelmingly expensive, and that's exactly what we see happening today. These shifts in public opinion are subtle, but once they become apparent, they are already so advanced that they're difficult to turn around. I don't have a cold. I don't know what's going on with my voice, but just another. It's impossible to put a date on the emergence of effective self-governance, but let's just say it started here. In ancient Greece with Solon, the lawgiver. Solon was the leader of the city-state of Athens. He's known as the father of the Greek democracy, and if there's any cornerstone of my talk today, it's this section on Solon. Because we can always go back to Solon and be rightly directed on what we should be doing with our own government. About 594, he issued the first constitution to settle long-standing conflicts between nobles and common people. The poor, along with their wives and children, were in slavery to the rich. All land was in the hands of a few. The existing set of laws had been issued by Draco. They were very harsh and favored the oligarchs of the time. To stabilize society, Solon decentralized political power and the money power. He knew that in order for society to be successful, the commoners had to have some power, some money, and the hope of success in order to create an incentive-driven society. Solon abolished slavery and allowed anyone to serve in the legislature. He was also the first to allow commoners to sit on a jury. They had the jury system, for God's sakes, 2,500 years ago. So key to our freedom today. To improve the money supply for the commoners, he ordered forgiveness of interest debt for mortgages once the principal was repaid, and doubled the money supply by calling in all precious coins and having them recoined with only half the precious metal as before. This reinvigorated the Athenian economy and brought on these results: the golden age of Athens. Naturally, the devaluation curtailed imports, but that only boosted internal production and exports. just as it does in nations today, showing the complete fallacy of this whole free trade nonsense upon which the TPP is built and all that stuff. The free trade is not free at all. It's slave trade. That's all it is. It's just the reverse. Typically, only the oligarchs lose out when protective tariffs are imposed. Did you know that as late as 1900, 90% of the U.S. income of what our government was based in, the income of our government was based on tariffs and excise taxes. That was before the income tax amendment was passed. As I said, typically only the oligarchs lose out when protective tariffs are imposed. But in Greece, they realized that this was a small price to pay for preventing the nation from falling into permanent chaos and lawlessness. The problem today is that the oligarchs know that if they wreck this country, they can jump on their jets and go somewhere else with relative ease. This type of mobility was not available in Stalin's day. And that's the difference. Consequently, Stalin remained popular with all classes of society. As Nobel Prize winner Frederick Soddy would write in 1934, it was recognized in Athens and Sparta, centuries before the birth of Christ, that one of the most vital prerogatives of the state was the sole right to issue money. But of equal importance was another factor. Stalin's reforms created a remarkable sense of civic duty, your country calling. Stalin's personal modesty serves as a powerful example for the rich and powerful of Athens. Government was now being run in the public interest, not just to benefit a powerful plutocracy. In the public interest became fashionable. This fostered a sense of civic duty that is sometimes called patriotic or even self-sacrificial, the willingness to contribute to the public interest. As long as my father worked, my mother was always involved in volunteer work. She was the head of the Red Cross in our county. I'm at the bottom left, the one holding his mouth saying, "Whatever you do, don't get into the speaking profession." That's known as monetary reform humor. There are very few examples of it, so I milk it as much as I can. Stalin's example cut across the class structure. It was this sense of public duty that helped Athens defeat the Persian army at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, where 10,000 Athenians repelled an army of 500,000, the largest in history. All of these attributes of Stalin's rule, every single one of them, has modern-day applicability. In order to fix our economic problems, we must restore the concept of civic duty, or buy-in. This can't be accomplished until government once again begins to serve the public interest. No machinations of central banks can possibly compare to this simple yet irresistible power. At the height of his power, Stalin rejected calls to use his tremendous prestige to make himself a tyrant. This later served as the model for George Washington's rejection of calls to become King of America after winning the American Revolution. Now let's look at our second macro influence, the over-consolidation of power problem. One of the most interesting paradoxes is that there are two opposing currents battling it out in this river of human history. On the one hand, you have this unstoppable will of humans to seek freedom from tyranny. But on the other hand, you have organized efforts to break down nationalism and replace it with globalism. This is always sold to nations as the only way to bring peace to the world and put an end to war. Peace? Well, maybe, but at what price? Certainly this transnational consolidation of power would follow Lord Acton's axiom. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I believe that any transnational organization, no matter how benign its original goals may seem to be, will turn despotic. This transnational despotism is no more sustainable than any other form of human slavery. Once they have nothing more to lose, the slaves will revolt. One of the most effective ways to destroy buy-in by the population is for a nation to agree to give up some of its national sovereignty and join a regional governance scheme. So if you're really interested in creating a sustainable governance that will last centuries, my advice would be to follow the ways of Solomon the lawgiver, who boosted national pride, and not those of the United Nations or the European Union. But the same goes for these trade agreements President Obama is currently trying to ram through Congress. One is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. The other is called the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, or TAFTA. How many people have heard of TAFTA? Very good, because that had kind of died on the vine and now suddenly is resurrected. President Obama is currently trying to get both TPP and TAFTA out of the hands of Congress by getting Congress to grant him so-called fast-track authority. All of these are direct attacks on national sovereignty, a gross over-consolidation of power. Why do people naturally rebel against them? Because people love their nations. It's an identity that makes them separate from their neighboring countries. It's just like in families. If you grew up in a family of 4 children like I did, everybody tries to find a separate identity. If the firstborn is a model child, for example, frequently the second will rebel against that identity to some extent, to try to become unique, a special human being. We all think we're special. We all know deep in our souls that we were sent here by the Creator to fulfill a special mission that only we were created to achieve, even these guys. So this is human nature, the necessity to create a distinct, special identity in the world family. Now, when you go attacking that nation-state identity, people don't like it. They tend to rebel against it. That's why the first attempt at global governance, the League of Nations, failed. That's why the United Nations has failed to become an effective form of transnational governance. And that is why the next experiment has been the European Union and these transnational trade agreements. So if humanity will not buy into world government in one big bite, they decided to try to do it in small bites. The EU, the TPP, and TAFTA were born. So what's the result? In Hungary in 2003, when the dangers of centralization of power across national borders was not yet recognized, Hungarians voted for EU membership with 83% of the vote. But Hungary never adopted the euro. They were proud of their sovereign national money, the forint. In late August, the new populist government paid off the last remaining installment of their IMF loans 1 year ahead of time, then kicked the IMF out of the country, and is now considering withdrawing from the EU altogether. Interestingly, a Hungarian publisher just made a deal to publish my book, No More National Debt, on sale outside, into Hungarian, one of the world's most difficult languages. Hungary is best friends in Europe with Poland. Poland joined the EU in 2004. It too never adopted the euro despite 64% initially favoring it. By 2011, those favoring the euro had slipped to 32%, and last year that plummeted to 22%. Poland today has one of the strongest economies in Europe. The UK, which joined the EU in 1973, has never adopted the euro and may soon try to withdraw from the European Union as the anti-EU political party, UKIP, continues to make huge gains in Parliament. Now, 85% of British laws are no longer made in London, but in the European Parliament. So again, we have these two opposite and very powerful currents of human opinion surging back and forth. It certainly seems to me that the oligarchs of Europe are favoring centralization of power, while the forces of Republican self-governance are waking up to the fact that these centralized power schemes will just leave their nations broke, powerless, and stuck in a national nightmare, such as Greece. This is my iconograph of a dictatorship. Very few people hold most of the power at the top, leaving the rest of us with very little to say at the bottom. Notice that those near the bottom feel very far removed from the decision makers at the top. Attaining increased freedom means moving from a very steep power pyramid to a very broad-based power pyramid, where power is spread out to the maximum extent which is politically practical. That doesn't mean the maximum extent, it means the maximum extent which is practical. and we the people get to vote on the rules. Does government look more like this today, where power is spread out broadly amongst the people? Or more like this, where very few people share the political power and the bottom layers feel very far removed from the decision leaders? So yes, power is getting more and more concentrated with every passing year. As a result, most people feel they don't have a say in their governance anymore. And once the public feels that it has no control over their governance, there is no buy-in. So we're at a fork in the road right now. National leaders have to decide which way they want to take their people, and there are only two choices. Will you take your nation down the dark path of ever-increasing control or lack of buy-in through transnational governance schemes, or will you choose the Solonic path of justice and liberty for all, under the rule of law and governed by an incentive-driven republic? The third macro factor is sovereign debt, or national debt. I'm just going to touch on these last two briefly because I'm almost out of time. I'm getting this guy waving at me already. So what's the problem? What's the problem with the national debt? First of all, there's the interest problem. This is something you rarely hear discussed on television. Why? Because it's such a huge number. In fiscal year 2013, the U.S. will pay about $450 billion of interest on a $17 trillion debt. You never hear that. But a new study by the University of California researcher says that the actual debt is now over $70 trillion. The new figures compiled by Professor James Hamilton adds for the first time the government support for housing and other loan guarantees, deposit insurance, actions taken by the Fed, and government trust funds. Certainly in a rising interest rate environment, interest payments alone could crush the U.S. economy. The second problem I have with sovereign debt is the control issue. Who do nations borrow from primarily? Banks. And what if the biggest banks don't like the policies of the U.S. government 5 years from now? Well, they just might decide to stop creating enough play money to support all this government debt. So this is the first problem with government debt. Remember the proverb, the borrower is servant to the lender. If government is the borrower, it is no longer the sovereign. The lender eventually comes to control the political process as well as the money system of the nation. Political science has devised a word for this condition. It's called plutocracy. One thing is for certain, no truly effective legislation to diminish the power of the biggest banks will ever come out of a legislature that is borrowing from these banks. So, in order to have any shot at developing a Solonic structure which rekindles buy-in of the citizenry, your government cannot be allowed to borrow. Not one lira, not one pound, not one Deutschmark or dollar. Never again from anyone. So now we come to the fourth and last point, the money creation power. Even if your country is not borrowing, there is still a big problem if your banks practice fractional reserve lending. Why? Because this means banks create the vast majority of the nation's money, and guess what? In the US and the UK, that's about 97% of the money supply. The truth is that the only American money are the coins in your pocket. Everything else is created by banks as an interest-bearing debt. Banks are corporations, and corporations are required to maximize their profits. What does this mean? It means that banks will never operate in the public interest. It is an impossibility for them to operate in the public interest. Therefore, you cannot give them the money power. You have to return the banks to full reserve lending. In other words, banks can only loan out $1 for every dollar of capital they have on their books. I know most people think that that's what goes on, but it's not. When you go in and take out a mortgage, they don't walk back into the vault and pull out a pile of money and give it to you. They just put digits in your account. Digits they don't actually have. They make it up. They make up 97% of it. And that's worldwide. I agree with Irving Fisher, the head of the Chicago School during the Great Depression in the 1930s. Nationalize money, but do not nationalize banking. We need commercial banks. They provide services we all use every day. They need to be the intermediaries between borrowers and lenders, such as with Islamic banking. not actually the money creators. The way a correct banking system should operate is the government would create all the money in the first instance, get all the seigniorage from that creation. Seigniorage means the profit from creating money. Then the government would sell that new money out to the banks at cost. Then the banks would compete to give the public the best deal. And just to correct a common misunderstanding, no monetary reformer believes that the legislature should have control over the quantity of the money supply. It has to be a separate arm of government, either the Treasury or a properly configured central bank. The abuse of this money creation monopoly in the past, especially for the past 100 years, is what has been the direct cause of the rise of cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin and the one in the lower right, Quark. People can't get enough money, and so this is just their natural workaround solution. These cryptocurrencies are really just internet-ready complementary currencies, and I support them wholeheartedly. They are not the ultimate solution, but because they do not uphold national sovereignty, but they are a much-needed step and might be the only way to break the power of the money masters at this point. That's it.